Hello and welcome to our July edition of our monthly webinar series. My name is Rob Shane. I'm the communications manager here at Ray. We appreciate you taking the time to join us today. We have a great panel with two great presentations, and then we'll open it up for about 20 minutes of Q&A at the end. If you do have questions or comments, feel free to post them in the Q&A or the chat section, and we will get to them at the end when we can. Before we get started, just a few things about Ray, a couple of announcements, upcoming events, things that we'd like you to know about us. First and foremost, Restore America's Estuaries is dedicated to the protection and restoration of bays and estuaries as essential resources for our nation. We are made up of 10 member groups from across the country, as you can see here. And we also have an affiliate member program, which currently has 7 members in it. If you are interested in joining Ray as an affiliate member, you can reach out to me after this or visit our website for more information. One thing we are super excited about coming up in October of this year in Cape May, we will be hosting our biennial Living Shorelines Tech Transfer Workshop. You can find more information on our website about that as well. Registration is now open, so if you'd like to join us, we hope you will. This will be our first in-person event since 2019, so we're super excited about that too. Also coming up, as many of you who know Ray, you know that our biennial Coastal and Estuarine Summit happens every other year. We are proud to announce that in 2022, we will be hosting the event in New Orleans. That will be December 4th through 8th of 2022 again. More information on that will come out here in the coming months, probably closer to the beginning of next year. But do block that on your calendar. We hope that you will join us in New Orleans as well. And of course, the reason we're here this month is to celebrate Habitat Month, which is a NOAA fisheries initiative. All over social media, you can use the hashtag Habitat Month to find more information, stories, high-end content from NOAA and others, celebrating how habitat connects our communities and our climate and improves our fisheries and our economy. So do take a look at that. You can also find more information on NOAA's website. The link's there down in the bottom corner as well. And of course, if you're interested in joining us for future events, future webinars, future meetings, future in-person events, the easiest way to do so is by checking us out on social media. Again, here's our handles here at the bottom. And if you have questions on that, feel free to reach out to us at the end too. Without further ado, I'd love to introduce our panelists. First and foremost, we have Katie Mosher. She's the Senior Director of Programs for the Billion Oyster Project. Katie, who was born in upstate New York, found her passion here in New York City, restoring oysters in New York Harbor. She's incredibly determined to get oysters in the water, but she doesn't stop there. She also strategically thinks about how to maximize Billion Oyster Project's collaborative efforts to realize long-term goals for restoring oysters to New York waters. Second, we have Brian Combs. He is a salmon habitat restoration biologist from the South Puget Sound Salmon Enhancement Group. Brian is an avid outdoorsman. He's been exploring his passion for natural history in the Pacific Northwest since 1995. He has a bachelor's of science from Evergreen State College with an emphasis in botany and ecology. And last but not least, Cole Baldino, also a salmon habitat restoration biologist for the South Puget Sound Salmon Enhancement Group. Cole grew up in Connecticut. He ultimately found himself at the State University of New York Environmental Science and Forestry School in Syracuse, New York. He's worked throughout the East Coast restoring brook trout habitat, and a little over 2 years ago joined the team at SPS-SEG to take his talents to helping with salmon and steelhead restoration. So we're excited to have these couple of people. We'll have their contact information at the end. Again, if you do have questions, please go ahead and put them in the chat. Otherwise, I am happy to turn the screen over to Katie to get us rolling today.
Great. Thank you so much, Rob. And thanks for everyone for having us here. It's really exciting to us to be presenting at this panel, and also just to be in the company of these other folks of Cole and Brian. So I'm really happy to tell you all a little bit about Billion Oyster Project today. We are based in New York City, and our mission is to restore oyster reefs to New York Harbor through public education initiatives. My job is the senior program director at Billion Oyster Project. So I have the pleasure of working with a huge group of people who all come from different perspectives about how to restore oysters and habitat with the people of New York. And so our mission, like our name says, is to restore 1 billion oysters. And we're hoping to do that by 2035. And we're also hoping to engage 1 million people in that process. And so that's a fraction of who we have in New York City, but we really believe that this is the way to make lasting sustainable change, is to really work with the students and the community groups and the restaurant patrons and everyone in New York City. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about how we came to be where we are. And so I have this little timeline running down the side of this slide, and I wanted to start out in 1609 because not only was that an important date, that's when Henry Hudson arrived in New York Harbor, but more importantly than that, the Canarsie and the Munsee Lenape tribes were already here, and we are on their land. And so this is a place that was already rich and robust and full of all kinds of fish and bird species when he arrived. And probably also around 200,000 acres of oyster reefs, which are now gone. That happened because of a combination, like in most urban environments, of dredging and overharvesting and disease, but especially for the pollution, which was causing a great deal of contamination in the water. So as we go down my timeline, after around the early 1800s, sandy ground, which is in Staten Island, became inhabited by the first free Black settlement in the United States. And that was important because that really kicked off the start of the fishery of oysters in New York Harbor. And it became a big booming industry. And by the early 1900s, all of that pollution really took hold, and the reefs were pretty much ruined. Flash forward to the 1970s and the Clean Water Act, which really had a big impact on improving the harbor. That sort of paved the way for a lot of environmental groups in New York to begin doing work like what we do. And we, in 2005, became the New York Harbor School, which is a public school, started. And many of the people who work at that public school doing career and technical educational training for high school students went on to become part of the Billion Oyster Project. So that's sort of our origin story. And in 2010, 2014, and 20, we started really digging into the work of oyster reef habitat. So that was a long introduction. So I'm going to show a little bit about the New York Harbor School, which next slide. Thanks. Oh, some pictures popped off, but you can see here, like, the people in these photos are all high school students. And a lot of our work really is based around what the students in the Harbor School are learning. And when the stars align, we're actually able to do a lot of that work with them. And as they grow and we grow, that relationship changes, but that's again part of our origin story and part of a lot of the work that we do with oyster reef restoration. Next slide. So another thing we do with young people and volunteers, all types of volunteers, is very similar to what other groups might call oyster gardening. We don't call it oyster gardening because the oysters in New York Harbor are not you can't eat them due to the pollution, and all of our waters are closed. So the gardening nomenclature doesn't really work for us. We call them oyster research stations. And we develop a lot of curriculum and tools that students can use to learn in the classroom. And so we've got a massive investment in writing about how to teach students about habitat restoration. And all of those little triangles represent different oyster cages that we have around New York Harbor. Next slide, please. So I'm starting small with those little cages, and I'm going to move up in scale to get to one of the larger restoration projects that I want to talk about. But this slide shows a number of different pilot scale restoration projects that we work on. And we call these field stations, and they're pilot scale, not only because we're still very young and learning how to do what we do. And so they're each a little bit different, but they're called field stations because they're places where we invite members of the community, school groups, sometimes we work with boating clubs to host our pilot scale reef structures, and then we work with them to monitor those structures. So we're teaching while we're in the field, but we're also collecting data. And we've been doing this sort of style of small scale restoration learning for about 6 years now. And so we've got this nice collection all over New York City of little reefs that people can visit and learn from. And next slide, please. So again, I said we're going to talk about I'm going to talk about some of the larger scale projects in a minute, but all of our projects depend really heavily on shell collection, like most oyster restoration projects do. We collect, so far we've collected about 1.7 million pounds of oyster shells since we started this program. These shells are collected directly from the restaurants in New York City. We work with about 75 restaurants, and we bring them to Governor's Island where we're based, and we have giant piles of shell that we cure, and then we use them on our restoration projects. To us, that's an exciting process in itself. But the other thing that we really love about the shell collection program is that it's also a source of connection for thousands of volunteers. So these shells, as they're curing, and we cure for typically about a year, are sometimes they're bagged, or they're sorted or cleaned or put into structures by an army of New Yorkers who come out and volunteer with us on Governor's Island. Between 4 and 6 days, depending on the year and the season. So that's where we get our substrate from. And then next slide, please. And then we're able to turn it into, these different types of projects. So I mentioned field stations earlier, and I wanted to share a little bit about one of our favorite, well, they're all our favorite, but this is definitely a very popular field station. It's Bush Terminal Park, which is in a New York City public park, and it's in the Sunset Park neighborhood of Brooklyn. And you can see here that there are 2 small lagoons in the upper right-hand corner of the aerial, and that's where we work. And this is an especially important site for us because these 2 lagoons are very protected, they're very quiet. And I mentioned earlier the high school that we collaborate with, New York Harbor School, their student scientific dive team uses this as a place to train and learn how to dive and understand how to collect data and monitor. So it's important to us for a number of reasons. It's also one of the few places that the Sunset Park community can access their shoreline. And again, in an urban environment, that's very, very important and really critical to us. So it's a great site. We have a bag shell reef, and we have 2 other smaller pilot reefs that are made out of gabions, and I'm going to explain what those are in a minute. Some of the challenges that are on the bottom of this slide are really typical to almost every place in New York Harbor. So we have, like most coastal cities, a problem with combined sewer overflows. So sewage is still a big issue for us. We really have to watch the weather. We try not to go in the water for 72 hours after a big rainstorm, which can be really frequent. And we also are struggling to some degree at this site because while it is newly remediated, that means that we also have to be very careful about what we place on the bottom and how we do it, because there is a cap, a sediment cap over the legacy contaminants that are still underneath the on the bottom of the lagoon. Access at this site, again, this is a general problem for New York Harbor. We don't have these long, beautiful sloping shorelines. Most everything is difficult to access. And in this case, it's also a bit of a safety concern for New York City Parks. So we try to work really carefully with them to design access protocols that help them feel everybody will be safe while they're in the water. Okay, next slide, please. So now we're getting into some of the bigger projects that we do. This was the first really large scale project that we worked on. We worked on this with a number of partners. We were not the lead on this. We collaborated with a whole team who came together because of the rebuilding of the former Tappan Zee Bridge, now the Mario Cuomo Bridge. And when that happened, the oyster reef habitat that existed was disturbed. And so the state funded this project to restore 6 acres of reef habitat. So we actually started working with the team in 2015. A very large team, there were engineers and scientists and us, came together to understand what was happening already, like what the extent of the reef coverage was. And it was a very exciting time for us. No one thought that there were any remnant oyster populations in New York Harbor. And so when it was discovered that there was actually, surprisingly, in this very, very low salinity area, it's frequently like almost zero for stretches of time, there is this very large population of oysters. So we can put substrate down with no oysters on it and it will be covered the next year. And that's what that upper photo is a reef ball that just became covered with oysters. And so it probably, to folks from the Chesapeake, it's like, yeah, that happens, but we'd never seen anything like that. So that was a very exciting realization for us. And the lower photo shows all of the gabions that what the gabions look like. So this is, again, another volunteer activity that we construct these steel frames, and then they have mesh cages with the shell inside them. And there's about 422 of these gabions and almost 900 reef balls. Next slide, please. So another big project that we have, and this is our second larger scale project. This is called the Soundview Reef, and this is a project where the Bronx River meets the Harlem River. And this is a site where regional partners have been working for well over a decade, doing various types of investigation and pilot scale oyster projects together. We chose this spot because there has been oyster recruitment there, which, as I mentioned, is not very common or very robust in New York Harbor, but it was one of the sites that we investigated that showed the most promise. So with the state being willing to provide funding, we gathered this team together. Hudson River Foundation is a primary partner of ours, and they do the science with Dr. Ray Grizzle from University of New Hampshire. We also work very closely with New York, New Jersey Baykeeper, Bronx River Alliance, Rocking the Boat. And these are different organizations in New York Harbor that bring a very special community, each of them, to the project, a very experienced set of skills. Baykeeper does a lot of the monitoring. And we do that because it's so important to us to work with the local communities wherever we are working, and to make sure that there's, sort of a place for everybody to do the great work that they do on these types of projects. So we're just about in the final year of this work, but so far we've built 5 acres of habitat and restored many millions of oysters. And so if you go to the next slide, I'll show you what that looks like. So this is again another shot of gabions going in the water. And so they're deployed from a barge, but they're a very special type of setting, of oyster setting for us, which I'm going to describe in another minute. But it's 173 of these steel framed units. And we've put in 14 million oysters, as I mentioned, and a lot of our shell. So that was exciting too, to see our shell pile shrink down over the course of a year, last year during the quarantine, to almost nothing. And so we're really trying to get that shell program back in gear. And you can see some of the things that we do while we're monitoring. We're of course looking at water quality. We're looking at how the benthic layer changes over time. We're studying the oysters, how they grow and what the survival is like. And we're also monitoring the reef footprint very closely so that we can understand what the sediment is doing over time, if it's accreting or if it's silting up in the cages. And so hopefully next year we'll have a great report to share about that. And again, as always, we're engaging students. Next slide, please. So these are the logos of all those partners I mentioned. I should have put these first, but again, it's that really rich, wonderful group of all types of partners, because that really makes the project so wonderful. Next slide, please. So in 2020, which was one of the dates that I had on my first slide as a key date for us, in 2020, when we realized that we needed to figure out how to make enough oysters for the Soundview project, we kicked it into high gear and did a lot of brainstorming to try to figure out how to set these oysters without an actual hatchery facility that could handle the capacity. So we decided to purchase 4 shipping containers and retrofit them as oyster setting tanks. And so we've plumbed them and wired them, and they're now sitting on a pier in the Red Hook Terminals facility, which is a port facility in New York Harbor. And they've given us access and space to do this so the barges can pull up. Next slide, please. And so you can see what that looks like, moving materials in and out. The water comes directly from the harbor. And, of course, it's filtered, but it really allows us to operate very efficiently and to make sure that the oysters, as they're on their way to the restoration site, are kept very happy and healthy. So the barge can pick those containers right up, the crane puts them on the barge, and then off they go to the installation site. Next slide, please. So getting the oysters there, this is just a little visual diagram. I'm not sure if folks can read those red tags, but the movement for us of the materials is very tricky. In New York Harbor, of course, the straightest shot would just be to go from island to island, but we still have to do some trucking because our volunteer program is run on Governor's Island. That means oyster cages make the trip across a ferry and then through the Brooklyn Battery Tunnel and across the BQE and then to another borough. And so it's a lot of logistics for us. and it is a very a relatively heavily engineered process. This is new again for us, so we think we're pretty excited about how it works, but every year that we do this, every time we do it, we're learning a lot more about how to be more and more efficient. Next slide, please. I'm going to try and fast track my finish here. But the main thing we're learning is that we don't want to stop. It's definitely not the same type of success that I think you might find in some of the other estuaries where the populations are, it's a given that you're going to get oyster recruitment. But what we're finding is very encouraging to us, that over the last almost 15 years that we've been doing this, we've seen more and more recruitment in New York Harbor every year. And we're finding places where the oysters grow really well. And the enhancement to the habitat that we're seeing is very exciting. We're seeing students and community groups getting just as excited as we are about that. And that's what really is propelling us to keep going and keep sort of scaling up our operations. Even though it's very challenging in the urban environment, we're really thrilled with the results so far. So that is the end of my presentation. And I think we're going to do questions later, but thank you again for having us present today.
Awesome, Katie. Thank you so much. I very much appreciate it. And now I have the unique pleasure of turning this over to Cole and Brian from the South Puget Sound Salmon Enhancement Group. So without further ado, go ahead and take it away.
Awesome. Thanks, Rob, and especially big thanks to Katie. I think the work you're doing back east, especially being an East Coaster, is super inspiring, especially around one of my favorite species of the striped bass. But let's take a jump over to the Pacific Northwest. I'm going to introduce our group and then turn it over to Brian to talk about one of our largest estuary projects to date. So we are the South Puget Sound Salmon Enhancement Group. We are one of 14 regional fisheries enhancement groups in Washington. We were designated in legislature during the Endangered Species Act when Pacific salmon were listed in 1991. And we make up the South Puget Sound, hence our namesake. You can see down there in the map, that little corner, number 5. And our mission is to protect and restore salmon populations and aquatic habitat with an emphasis on ecosystem function through scientifically informed projects, community education, and volunteer involvement. We work to protect all 7 salmon species throughout all 7 species of Pacific salmon, and none of this work can be done without our tribal partners and original stewards of this land, the Nisqually, the Puyallup, and the Squaxin Island tribes. So next slide, Rob. Just taking a closer look into our work area. Some of our major watersheds that you'll be hearing about originate at the peaks of Mount Rainier, Washington's tallest peak, and flow down into the capital in the estuaries of Tacoma and Olympia. So really a diverse and unique work setting that you'll hear about today. Next slide. Just looking at some of our work, I had to throw a fish picture up there. But not only do we focus on nearshore and estuary enhancement, but we work on fish passage and barrier removal projects, floodplain and wetland reconnection, large woody debris installation, riparian plantings, and a lot more. After the presentation, I'll drop a couple links in the chat and send them out as well. We've got a couple interactive maps that Brian's going to touch on about the project you're about to hear today. So without further ado, I'm going to turn this over to Brian Combs, the one who really made this project possible from funding to implementation. It was great to be out on site this year to watch this project get built. From a far view, it might look like we're moving a bunch of dirt, but he's going to get into the nitty gritty and really show you what we've done throughout Oakland Bay. So take it away, Brian.
Thanks, Cole. Good morning, everyone. Well, it's still morning for us on the West Coast. Today, I'm going to talk to you about the West Oakland Bay Restoration Project here in Puget Sound, and just wanted to first of all give a shout out to the Squaxin Island tribe and recognize their vision and leadership in this project. They're the ones that really were the original sponsors, and we've been lucky enough to be brought in to implement the project. And we'll go to a quick map on the next slide. So again, we're up here in Washington State. We're at the southern end of Puget Sound, which is on par with Chesapeake Bay as one of the largest estuary systems in the US. There are numerous inlets and bays and different waterways in the Puget Sound, as you can see here. Puget Sound is that long body of water running north-south, and we're all the way at the southern end. Cole and I are in Olympia today. The West Oakland Bay project is just northwest of us, right in the town of Shelton. Next slide, please. So if we zoom in a little bit closer, this shows you Oakland Bay. The project area is in the left-hand corner of the bay there, with some of the design contours of the proposed salt marsh restoration area in the yellow and white. Goldsboro Creek and Shelton Creek are coming in from the left. Those are shown with the blue line graphics coming into what used to be the former estuary of Goldsboro and Shelton Creeks. Oakland Bay it has 7 salmon bearing streams, with Goldsboro Creek being the largest of the 7 salmon bearing streams. We've got native wild runs of coho and chum salmon, and the bay is also used by juvenile Chinook salmon that come from other rivers from all over Puget Sound to rear and feed in Oakland Bay. So it's a super important area for Pacific salmon. Oakland Bay is also one of the largest shellfish growing areas in Washington and produces a significant portion of manila clams and oysters that go all across America and Canada. So the shellfish resource is really important. And so obviously the water quality considerations are pretty big here, and the restoration project will have a benefit for water quality as well as fish and wildlife. Next slide, please. So this graphic shows the 1800s T sheets, which were, for those of you that aren't familiar with the T sheets, those were the original surveyor's maps that were made when European settlers first started navigating the waterways and making survey maps. And so you can see on the left-hand side the shoreline and the estuary area, which has now been completely erased and filled in when they built the waterfront in the late 1800s and early 1900s. So essentially the Goldsboro Creek estuary was filled. The waterfront was pushed out to the east, and the whole mouth of the creek and everything shifted into what became mud flats. Next slide. So after the waterfront was built in the early 1900s, the area became highly industrialized. The town of Shelton, right here on the waterfront, was one of the centers of industrial logging and milling. So there were several mills along the waterfront, and the area for the last 100 years has been used for intensive commercial and industrial uses, with all sorts of impacts to the harbor, including dredging and filling, lots of log rafts coming and going, and just a lot of changes over the last 100 years. Some of the industrial uses have backed off, though. Some of the mills have gone away just due to various economic changes. There is still a big mill on the waterfront there, but they're not using the harbor as much as they used to for importing logs on the log rafts. You can see some log rafts in the South Harbor here. But basically what happened is the former mill owners that had control of the tidelands agreed to basically give the northern part of the harbor to conservation efforts. There was no longer a need to use it for the industrial uses. And so there was an agreement to give the North Harbor to conservation, which eventually led to this project being possible. And the area now is under a conservation easement, which will protect the tidelands and the tidal areas in perpetuity. And so the basic vision of this project is to turn it from this to the next graphic, if you will. So basically turn it back into a functioning estuary with salt marsh habitat. This is an artist's graphic of the vision of the project, which shows 3 lobes or 3 areas where the salt marsh recreation would take place. And, you know, basically the goal is pretty simple, which is to have vegetated salt marsh, complex flow paths for the creeks, and forested riparian areas around the edges. And next slide, please. So I borrowed this slide from Marit Larson with New York Parks. So New York City Parks is getting a nod today in both presentations. I want to thank Marit for her guidance and input on some salt marsh creation projects that they had done. We actually in South Puget Sound were not aware of any projects in Puget Sound to actually create salt marsh on the scale that we're trying to do. And so I reached out around the country to various project managers and ecologists, and found out that there have been some other creation projects. And so the Jamaica Bay Marsh Island was one of them that Marit shared with me, where they basically created a marsh island. And it's essentially exactly what we wanted to do, with bringing in clean sediment and, you know, building it up to the elevations that would support salt marsh. I guess I didn't point out that the degraded mudflat area in Oakland Bay, where we wanted to do the project, a lot of it is at or around mean lower low water, or within like a few feet of mean lower low water. We have like a 15-foot tidal swing. So for those of you in other parts of the country where you only have you know, a few feet of tidal swing every day, we're on a different scale where we've got a 15-foot tidal swing. So in other words, we have to bring in up to like 10 to 15 feet of clean fill to get to the elevations where salt marsh vegetation can grow. And so again, the Jamaica Bay Marsh Island was an example of how we could bring in clean fill and make it work. Next slide. And another example that I found was the thin layer placement website. Many of you might be familiar with this technique. I just borrowed this slide from their homepage, where they show several projects in the Gulf states and in the Atlantic where they're doing what they call thin layer placement, which is, it's sort of like marsh nourishment, where they're just adding a thin layer of sediment to existing marshes to combat erosion or various factors that are degrading the marshes. And so there are several examples of projects where they use clean dredge material or other clean sediment to nourish the marsh. I think they also had some projects though where it was even more involved than just a thin layer, where they were adding several feet of sediment. So that was another kind of example to us of what we could do. Next slide, please. So again, one of the really fundamental principles of our concept was that if you build it, they will come, so to speak. The idea was that if we created elevations with the appropriate substrate that natural salt marsh vegetation will recruit itself and grow. So one thing we did is we went to some analog marshes that are in Oakland Bay. They're very close to the project site. This shows one of the sites called the Twin Rivers site, which is another small estuary just about a mile or so away from our project. And we sampled salt marsh vegetation at various locations to map the elevation profile. And so what you can see here is that between the red arrows are basically the zones where salt marsh vegetation were found. And so again, for us, that's in the 9 to 15 tidal range of mean low or low water datum. So we had some Glaucus meridema, I think it's now Lysomachia meridema, right around the 9-foot mark. And then starting around 12 feet is where it really starts seeing a lot more abundant marsh plants. So that was basically that's kind of what set our design elevations, if you will, based on that range of where salt marsh occurs. Next slide. So this is a drone shot showing the first building of what we call the west lobe. Originally, when we started on this project, we envisioned bringing in material on barges. We thought we would probably be able to get clean dredge material that was going to just be disposed of somewhere, and it would be a beneficial reuse of that material. We're still interested in that concept, but basically what happened early on was that it just did not pencil out from a budget perspective to do that. Part of the challenge is that Oakland Bay is kind of far away from the main transport waterways, and so it would actually take quite a while for a transport barge to come into the bay. And then the project area is so narrow and shallow that a large transport barge would then have to offload the materials to smaller conveyance mechanisms to get the material down into the project area. So we moved to a different concept, which was to actually come in from the land and to use basically a bulk filler material for the mass marsh prism, and then add marsh substrate to the top of that to create the substrate for vegetation growth. So this material in this picture is actually a gravelly, kind of a sandy gravelly material that came from a nearby pit. It's a existing forest gravel pit. So this is native glacial based gravel that's native to our area. But we were able to get that at a very good rate, and basically brought it in trucks, and then had it spread with the bulldozers and the equipment, as you can see here. And next slide. And then this shot shows later on in the project when the marsh substrate is getting added, and that marsh substrate is more typical of what you'd see in marsh soils. So it's this very silty sand material with some clays mixed into it. And just very briefly, that material also came from a nearby site, which was kind of a fortuitous scenario in which the Washington State Department of Transportation was doing actually a fish passage project. So it was also a salmon restoration project on Highway 10, near Highway 101, but it's a major retrofit to provide fish passage. And so they basically needed to redirect the stream channel of Coffee Creek. And so in order to do that, they were excavating and generating clean sediment that they needed to get rid of. And so it was actually just perfect for what we needed. And ironically, it's the same type of floodplain sediment that came from Goldsboro Creek and Coffee Creek, which is a tributary. So it's the same exact sediment that would have been in the marsh anyways. So that was a pretty interesting twist to the story. One thing I did just want to add also is that on the left-hand side of the screen, you can see Goldsboro Creek coming in there. Early on in the project, there was a phase to install engineered log jams. And so you can see those log jams out there. And those are basically going to trap sediment and add to the accretion of the marsh, and also provide diverse flow paths for Goldsboro Creek to sort of mimic what would be more typical in a branched alluvial river area. So that was an early part of the project. Next. Oh, I'm running out of time. So how are we doing, Rob? 2 minutes or?
Yeah, if you could wrap it up in a minute or two.
Okay, I'm going to move pretty quickly through these last couple slides then. Just wanted to honor some of the diversified funding that we have. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the numbers, but we did get significant funding from National Coastal Wetlands, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, our state Salmon Recovery Funding Board, and then a whole bunch of local partners as well. Next slide. So again, the west lobe on the west side, left side, and then the south lobe on the bottom of the screen are now complete. Those represent about 17-acre salt marsh area. And then the north lobe is actually the biggest lobe that is still in the planning process. That's about an 18-acre area. And go ahead, Rob. I think I'll have to skip this one, please. Just really quick, we also removed 300 creosote pilings as part of the project. So that was a big boost to water quality. And next slide. So we are starting to see the salt marsh recruitment. This slide shows some algae that moved in initially, and then 2 of our native vascular salt marsh species. So it's happening slowly. It's been about a year and a half since the west lobe was completed, but we are starting to see the seedlings popping up. And I think I'm about out of time, so I'll go ahead and zip to the last slide, Rob. Okay, so briefly, we just zipped through a couple slides which talked about our monitoring that's going on. And so we are doing monitoring of the vegetation. But in terms of what do we do next, as far as soil changes and carbon sequestration and all of the interesting questions that you could ask about a project like this, we'd love to do monitoring. We don't currently have any funding for that monitoring, but my hope is that all of those things will come together and we'll be able to do some more complex monitoring in addition to the vegetation monitoring that we are doing. Climate change and sea level rise obviously is a big problem for marshes. The design of our project does have about a 5-foot tolerance for sea level rise. So that'll add some additional years of life to it before, it may eventually get drowned out, which of course is something that we're dealing with all of our marshes. But I think one of the interesting things about this project and the thin layer placement and other projects is that it shows opportunities to recreate or to add marsh areas in the future. We'd like to do a little bit of a better geomorphic design for the north lobe. We need about $5 million of funding. So that gives you just a sense of the scale of the cost for a project like this. And I think I'll go ahead and wrap it up. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Brian and Cole and everyone else. I'm going to ask our panelists to come back on video here. As we finish up, I did want to highlight a tool that Restore America's Estuaries and NOAA put together called the Coastal Restoration Toolkit. This is a website you can find, restoreyourcoast.org. That'll walk you through the first steps of planning a restoration project in your local community as well. So I do encourage you to check that out if you're sitting at home thinking about especially as some of these projects you've heard about today, I could probably do that in my local area, but I'm not quite sure where to start. Who do I talk to? What do I need? This will be your one-stop shop for getting all those questions answered. And we do encourage you to check it out. We're happy to announce that the toolkit officially turned 1 this year. So that's awesome. And we thank NOAA for their support and everybody else who helped us build this tool. Again, I mentioned that we would have contact info for everybody here at the end. So as you can see, I'll leave that up, and I'll open kind of the questions here on my own. And I do encourage you, we've got about 10 minutes left. So if you do have questions, feel free to type them into the chat box. I guess I'll start with Katie, maybe. You kind of alluded to this in your talk, but, we kind of think of estuaries as being these, beautiful faraway places sometimes with tall grasses and fish and oysters, but, you do all your work there in New York Harbor, which, is not uncommon because 40% of our country actually live in estuary areas. Can you talk a little bit about maybe the difficulty that you find in maybe perception from the general public or funders or other groups when you tell them that you're restoring, a harbor that is surrounded by 8 million people? Go ahead.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that the perception is different for all of our stakeholders. We have started to notice just in the time we've been doing this kind of work that people aren't quite as shocked quite as frequently that we're doing this kind of work, although that's still a common thing to hear is like, what, is the water clean enough? And while there are ongoing problems with combined sewer overflow all the time, the other sort of brighter side of that is that frequently the water, I'm not sure if frequently, but often there is a good enough water quality that you can swim. And those goals of having fishable and swimmable water really matter to us. And of course, that's part of why we keep doing this. And then I think in terms of the other side of it, from maybe from some of the agencies or the larger federal agencies or restoration practitioners outside of the city who we talk about our work with, it is really a challenge to explain why things are, as I said, so heavily engineered. We've started working that way, sort of based on the experience we had in particular parts of New York Harbor. I don't think that our work will always need to be like that, or that it will need to be that engineered at every site. Certainly, we do want to have, as much natural material going into the water as possible. We strive to really do as much as we can with just shell reefs and spat on shell. And we're really trying hard to eliminate the use of plastic netting, plastic bags, anything like that, coated mesh from all of our materials. So all of that is really important to us. And we're very interested in talking with anyone who has ideas or wants to put brains together with us to think about materials and working in the urban environment.
Great, thank you. Thank you for that. And I guess next question for Cole and Brian, this one came in from Suzanne. To what degree have you all worked with, if any, the shellfish aquaculture industry up there in the Northwest? You did mention, the mussels or clams, I think it was, that are contributing to water quality improvements, but have you worked with any of the commercial groups?
Yeah, great question. I would say that we don't really work super closely with them, but we are conducting outreach, and we have gotten some endorsements for the project from Taylor Shellfish, which some of you folks might have heard of. I think they're one of the largest, if not the largest, commercial shellfish supply company in the country. So they have significant assets in Oakland Bay, and they've endorsed our project. You know, frankly, I think that a lot of the shellfish folks in Oakland Bay were concerned about our project initially because we're placing sediment. And so there was a lot of concern about the sediment drifting and causing a water quality problem. Of course, we have very stringent permitting requirements with respect to turbidity and water quality that we had to follow. And the projects went really, really well. The sediment was able to be contained and it didn't cause a problem for shellfish. And then I think once we got over that hurdle, a lot of the shellfish growers realized that our project is actually going to be a big benefit to shellfish because it's going to be a vegetated marsh, which will help to clean and filter water. So, you know, we are starting to make those bridges, if you will, with the shellfish companies, and Taylor Shellfish, like I said, is endorsed the project.
Awesome. Thank you, Brian. And I guess question for Cole, you know, you've seen restoration now on both the East and the West Coast. You know, obviously our attendees here probably come from a pretty diverse geographic area across the country. Can you talk a little bit about the similarities that you've seen and maybe some of the differences in, say, permitting or, you know, financing that might be available for, you know, keystone species? I know you did brook trout habitat here in the East, and now you do salmon habitat in the West Coast.
Totally. Yeah, and that's a good question and always a topic to discuss. And I think the main takeaway from being on both coasts is that, you know, estuaries are recognized as really these critical habitats by both East and West coasters, and really the communities rally around them, you know, whether it's the striped bass or the oysters of the East Coast or the salmon of the Pacific Northwest. We recognize that these estuary habitats play such a vital role in nursery habitat and that commingling of fresh and salt water. And, you know, the funding is there. It's not at a level that I think we would all like to see. You know, just from our perspective on this project, we're looking for millions and millions of dollars to restore this estuary, but, you know, people are rallying behind it, and, you know, funders are, you know, putting dollars in what they have towards the estuaries. So, you know, it's an optimistic outlook, I think, from my perspective, seeing both an East and West Coast perspective there.
Great, thanks. That's great to hear. Katie, we had a question for you. What are your water quality measurements to determine if water is safe to swim in? And I'm curious to hear the answer on that.
Yeah, so we work with a number of partners on a community science program, and they're looking at fecal coliform. And we have also, of course, there's a city program to monitor water quality, but we use this community science program to help us get a better sense of real-time actual data that's not based on modeling. And so right now that program is being contributed to by, I think there's something like 70 community scientists who are collecting samples all over New York Harbor just by hand, and then running them to a lab so that the results can be released once a week. And then that is published in an email. That's not a great system. I mean, it's a good system. It's good community science. It's great information. We hope that, you know, we can continue to get better and better information that is, you know, as long as the CSOs are existing, we really need to know whether or not the water is safe to swim in at any point. But that technology doesn't really exist. There's no instant, you know, dip a stick in it and it'll tell you if it's clean, obviously, in an estuary. So that's what we're working with right now. And until we have better information, we rely on that window, that 72-hour window that I described earlier, if there's been a heavy rain event, and we'll just keep our folks out of the water until that time.
Great, thanks. And I have time for one more question. So I'm going to ask it of Cole. Where exactly can I catch a salmon like that? Can you please send me the coordinates?
You better not, Cole. You'd better not give him the coordinates.
Well, I've known Rob for a couple of years, and get on a plane and come out here, and I'll blindfold you, bring you to the spot, and put you on it. But no coordinates are getting sent out today.
All right. Well, I appreciate everybody's time. Again, I want to thank you all for joining. I want to thank the people out there in the audience for joining us. I also would like to thank NOAA for again sponsoring this month, the Habitat Month 2021. We've had a great time participating in it. I'd like to just plug one more time the Coastal Restoration Toolkit. If you haven't had a chance to check it out, please do. Please share it with your friends. We'd love to know what you think. There's a survey you can take once you get onto the page. And with that, I will wish everybody a good afternoon and rest of your morning. And we will hopefully see you here next month for our August version of our monthly webinar series. Thank you very much and have a great day.